In 1922, more than 80,000 small-town diners lined America's back roads, dirt highways, and rural crossings. Every coal patch, every timber settlement, every farming village had one: a low wooden counter, a cast-iron griddle, and a cook who started the fire before dawn. These were not restaurants. They were the heartbeat of American working life. Then the interstate came, the small towns emptied, and the diners vanished with them. Number 15 on this list was served every single morning for 30 years at a backroad Alabama counter, and no cookbook has ever recorded it. Number 8 is so deeply antique that the last known written record appears in an 1891 rural Ohio agricultural journal. And number 1, the breakfast that fed an entire generation of American workers, has been so completely forgotten that even food historians rarely speak its name. These are 25 forgotten small-town diner breakfasts that disappeared from America's backroads forever. Hit that subscribe button now because these stories deserve to be remembered. 1. Spoon bread soufflé with cane vinegar drizzle, Virginia Piedmont counter. Most people have never heard of spoon bread soufflé. But in the small farming towns of Virginia's Piedmont region, this was not a special occasion dish. This was Tuesday morning. This was what a tobacco farmer ate before the sun fully cleared the ridge. Spoon bread itself dates back to at least the 1840s, documented in Virginia household records as a staple of both plantation kitchens and working-class tables alike. But the diner version was different. The cook would whip the cornmeal batter until it was almost airy, pour it into a cast-iron skillet, and finish it with a thin drizzle of local cane vinegar, sharp, tangy, and completely unlike anything on the modern breakfast menu. That vinegar cut through the richness in a way that no syrup ever could. By the 1950s, this dish had already begun disappearing as packaged pancake mixes took over diner counters across Virginia. The last recorded mention of it appears in a 1953 Pittsylvania County Church cookbook, buried in a handwritten footnote. Nobody preserved the recipe. Nobody thought they needed to. 2. Rye berry porridge with pickled watermelon rind, Wisconsin farm diner. Wisconsin in January is a different world. The cold comes in hard off Lake Michigan, and by 5 in the morning, field workers and dairy hands needed something that would hold them until noon without question. Rye berry porridge was that dish. Whole rye kernels, slow-cooked overnight on a wood stove, served thick and steaming with a side of pickled watermelon rind that had been put up the previous summer. The combination sounds unusual today, but it was pure practical genius. The rye provided dense, lasting energy. The pickled rind cut the heaviness with a bright, vinegary sweetness that woke the palate up completely. German and Scandinavian immigrant communities brought this tradition into Wisconsin's small-town diners during the late 1800s, and it survived quietly on backroad counters well into the 1940s. Food historians have largely overlooked it because it left almost no written record. It was working-class food, and working-class food was rarely considered worth documenting. One 1938 Dane County Farm Journal mentions it briefly as the standard winter breakfast at 3 local road diners. After that, silence. 3. Fried mush cakes with pawpaw butter, Ohio River Road stop. The pawpaw is America's largest native fruit, and for most of the 19th century, it was everywhere along the Ohio River Valley. Settlers ate it, travelers carried it, and small-town diner cooks turned it into a breakfast butter that was spread thick over fried mush cakes every single morning from late summer through early fall. Fried mush cakes were simple: cornmeal mush cooked the night before, sliced cold, and fried hard on a griddle until the outside turned deep golden and slightly crisp. The pawpaw butter changed everything. Rich, custardy, almost tropical in flavor, it melted into the hot cakes and created something that no modern breakfast even comes close to replicating. Ohio River Road stops between Marietta and Cincinnati served this combination regularly through the 1890s, documented in several surviving traveler accounts from that era. But by the early 1900s, pawpaw trees were being cleared for farmland, the fruit disappeared from commerce, and the butter vanished with it. The mush cakes survived in other forms. The pawpaw butter did not. An 1889 Ohio River traveler's diary describes it simply as the finest thing he ate on the entire journey west. 4. Smoked whitefish scramble with rye toast, Great Lakes Shoreline Diner. Along the southern shoreline of Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, the fishing communities that built themselves around the whitefish trade developed a breakfast culture that the rest of America never noticed and never recorded. Smoked whitefish scramble was the anchor of that culture. Flaked cold smoked whitefish folded into fresh eggs, cooked low and slow until just set, served over thick-cut rye toast with a scrape of butter. The smokiness of the fish ran through every bite of egg. The rye toast held up under the weight without going soft. It was a complete, deeply satisfying plate built entirely from what the lake and the land provided. Finnish and Norwegian fishing families brought the smoking traditions, and small shoreline diners absorbed those traditions into their daily menus by the 1880s. A 1912 Marquette County, Michigan, trade publication lists smoked whitefish scramble as the most commonly ordered morning plate at 4 separate lakeside counters. Commercial fishing collapsed on the Great Lakes through the mid-20th century, and the fresh smoked whitefish supply dried up with it. The dish had no ingredients left to sustain it. It disappeared without ceremony, the way most working food does. 5. Crackling bread with ribbon cane syrup, Louisiana Crossroads Cafe. There is a specific kind of Louisiana morning that belongs entirely to the Crossroads Cafe. A gravel parking lot. A screen door that never closes properly. The smell of wood smoke and hot grease hitting you before you even step inside. And on the counter, a cast iron skillet of crackling bread that had been in the oven since 4 in the morning. Crackling bread was cornbread made with hog cracklings, the crisp, rendered pieces of pork fat, and skin left over after lard making. Those cracklings went directly into the batter, giving every bite a salty, smoky, deeply savory richness. Then the ribbon cane syrup came, dark, complex, faintly bitter, nothing like commercial molasses, poured straight over the hot bread until it soaked through completely. This was breakfast in rural Louisiana from the 1860s well into the 1940s. It was documented in several Louisiana Agricultural Society records as the standard morning meal for sugarcane field workers and timber crews alike. Ribbon cane syrup production collapsed after World War II as commercial sweeteners took over. Without the syrup, the dish lost its soul. The Crossroads cafes closed one by one, and crackling bread mornings became a memory that only the oldest Louisianans still carry. 6. Dried cherry griddle cakes with venison sausage, Upper Michigan logging camp style. Upper Michigan in the logging era was one of the most physically demanding work environments in American history. Men felled timber in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, and they needed a breakfast that matched that reality. Dried cherry griddle cakes with venison sausage was that breakfast. The cherries, tart Montmorency varieties dried through the previous autumn, were folded directly into a thick griddle cake batter, giving bursts of intense, concentrated flavor against the neutral grain. The venison sausage was seasoned with wild sage and black pepper, coarse ground and pan-fried until the outside crisp dark. Together, the sweetness of the cherry and the gamey richness of the venison created a combination that sustained a man through 6 hours of hard timber work without question. Logging camp cook records from Marquette and Ontonagon counties, dating to the 1880s and 1890s, list this combination repeatedly as a standard winter morning offering. When the great logging era ended and the camps closed, the cooks scattered, and nobody carried the recipes into the mainstream. Small diners near the old timber towns served versions of it into the 1930s. After that, it simply stopped. 7. Head cheese and fried eggs on cornbread, Ozark Mountain counterplate. The Ozark Mountains kept their own food culture for generations, largely because geography kept outsiders out. The roads were bad, the communities were isolated, and the cooking stayed true to what the land and the hog provided. Head cheese and fried eggs on cornbread was a standard Ozark diner morning plate from the 1870s well into the 1940s. Head cheese, made from the slow-cooked, seasoned, and pressed meat of a hog's head, was sliced thick and laid cold beside 2 fried eggs on a square of dense yellow cornbread. No plate in the American diner tradition was more honest about where food came from or more complete in what it provided. The gelatin in the head cheese, the fat in the egg yolk, the grain in the cornbread, it was nutritionally perfect for a working morning. Missouri and Arkansas County Fair cookbooks from the 1890s through the 1910s document this plate consistently as the most common breakfast offering at rural Ozark eating establishments. As hog butchering moved to industrial facilities after World War II, head cheese became harder to source locally. The dish lost its foundation, and within a decade it had vanished from Ozark counters entirely. 8. Chicken and Dumplings Breakfast Bowl, Tennessee Backroad Diner. Chicken and dumplings for breakfast sounds like a mistake to modern ears. It was not a mistake. In rural Tennessee, where backroad diners served whatever was abundant, practical, and filling, a warm bowl of chicken and dumplings at 6 in the morning was not unusual. It was expected. The chicken would have been stewing overnight in a heavy pot, the broth deepening through the dark hours. The dumplings dropped in fresh at first light, so they were fat and tender by the time the first customers walked through the door. Tennessee backroad diners documented in county historical records through the 1920s and 1930s commonly listed chicken and dumplings as a morning option alongside eggs and biscuits. It was cheaper than a full egg plate on lean weeks, more filling than porridge, and it used every part of older hens that no longer laid. Nothing was wasted and nothing was pretentious. It was pure Appalachian practicality translated into a bowl. When standardized diner menus began spreading through rural Tennessee in the 1940s and 1950s, chicken and dumplings was pushed off the breakfast board entirely. It survived on lunch and supper menus, but lost its morning identity completely and permanently. 9. Souse meat hash with boiled grits, Piedmont, Carolina Diner. Souse meat is one of those ingredients that defined an entire regional food culture and then quietly disappeared from public consciousness within a single generation. In the Piedmont region of North and South Carolina, souse, pickled pork made from the head, feet, and offal of the hog, seasoned with vinegar, red pepper, and sage, was a staple so common that most families made it at home every winter hog-killing season. The diner version turned it into hash. Chopped souse meat fried hard on a flat iron griddle with onion and black pepper, served alongside a bowl of boiled white grits with a pat of butter melting across the top. The vinegar tang of the souse cut through the mildness of the grits in a way that made the whole plate feel alive and sharp. Piedmont, Carolina Agricultural Society records from the 1890s and early 1900s reference souse hash regularly as a feature of rural eating establishments throughout the region. Industrial meat processing after World War II standardized pork cuts and eliminated the whole hog butchering culture that produced souse. Without that culture, the ingredient disappeared from diners, and the hash went with it. 10. Fried muskrat with scrambled eggs, Chesapeake Bay Waterman's Breakfast. This is the one that stops people cold. Muskrat, on the breakfast plate, with scrambled eggs. And yet, along the marshy tidal shores of the Chesapeake Bay, particularly in Maryland's Dorchester County and the Delaware Shore communities, fried muskrat was not exotic. It was Tuesday. Watermen who spent their mornings pulling crab pots and oyster tongs ate muskrat the way inland farmers ate bacon, as the available, affordable, high-protein anchor of the morning meal. Properly prepared muskrat, skinned and soaked overnight in salted water, then pan-fried in lard until the outside crisp dark, tastes remarkably similar to dark meat chicken or wild duck. Paired with scrambled eggs and a biscuit, it was a complete and deeply satisfying working breakfast. Maryland's Chesapeake Shore diners served muskrat regularly from the mid-1800s through the 1950s, and several surviving Waterman community cookbooks from Dorchester County document the preparation in detail. Muskrat trapping declined sharply after the 1960s as marshland was developed and fur markets collapsed. The ingredient left the diner counter, and one of the most honest and historically significant breakfasts on the entire Chesapeake simply ceased to exist. 11. Creamed chipped goose on biscuits, Minnesota Prairie Diner. Most Americans know creamed chipped beef, the military staple that soldiers famously renamed with an unprintable phrase. Far fewer know that across the Minnesota Prairie, small-town diners served a local variation that predates the military version and surpasses it completely. Creamed chipped goose. Thin-sliced dried and salted wild goose, creamed in a white gravy seasoned with black pepper and a touch of dried sage, poured over split baking powder biscuits that had just come out of the oven. The goose brought a richer, darker, wilder flavor than beef ever could, and the sage in the gravy tied it directly to the prairie landscape that produced the bird. Scandinavian and German immigrant communities in Minnesota's prairie counties developed this dish in the 1870s and 1880s as a way to preserve the geese they hunted each autumn. Small diners in communities like Wilmar, Marshall, and Redwood Falls served it through the early 1900s. A 1909 Yellow Medicine County Community Cookbook includes a full recipe under the heading, The Standard Morning Plate of the Prairie Counter. Migratory bird protection laws in the mid-20th century restricted goose hunting sharply. The preserved goose supply dried up, and the dish vanished from Minnesota menus without leaving a single descendant. 12. Hog jowl and turnip green hash, Alabama Tulane Special. Alabama's Tulane highways in the early 20th century were lined with small wooden structures that barely qualified as buildings: low ceilings, screen windows, a counter with 6 stools, and a cook who had been awake since 3 in the morning. These were the places that fed the rural South, and they served food that the rest of America has entirely forgotten. Hog jowl and turnip green hash was a signature of that world. Cured hog jowl, smokier and fattier than bacon, with a depth of flavor that bacon cannot match, was chopped and fried down with leftover boiled turnip greens until the whole mass caramelized into a dark, intensely savory hash on the flat iron. Served with cornbread and a glass of buttermilk, it was a complete Alabama morning. Alabama County Fair records and rural church cookbooks from the 1890s through the 1920s document hog jowl hash as a staple of small roadside eating establishments throughout the Black Belt region. The industrialization of Southern food after World War II pushed standardized bacon and eggs onto every diner menu, and the regional specificity of hog jowl hash was lost in the process. Nobody replaced it. It simply stopped being made. 13. Roasted barley coffee with chicory cake, New Orleans Bayou breakfast stop. Before there was Café au lait at the French Market, before there was Café du Monde, there were the Bayou breakfast stops that served the workers who built and maintained the wetland infrastructure of southern Louisiana. And at those stops, the morning drink was not coffee as most Americans understood it. It was roasted barley coffee. Whole barley kernels roasted dark and brewed like coffee, served thick and bitter alongside chicory cake. The cake itself was not sweet. It was a dense, slightly bitter cornmeal cake flavored with dried chicory root, eaten plain or with a smear of cane syrup. The combination was entirely self-sufficient. 2 bitter, earthy flavors that balanced each other and provided sustained energy for hard physical labor in brutal humidity. Louisiana Bayou work records from the 1870s and 1880s document roasted barley coffee as the standard morning beverage at temporary work camps and small permanent roadside stops throughout the Atchafalaya Basin. As commercial coffee became affordable and widely available in the early 1900s, barley coffee disappeared almost overnight. The chicory cake survived in fragmentary form in a few rural communities into the 1930s before it too vanished completely. 14. Smearcase on toast with stewed prunes, Pennsylvania Dutch Road Diner. The Pennsylvania Dutch built one of the most distinctive and self-contained food cultures in American history, and for generations, their backroad diners served a morning plate that almost nobody outside their communities ever tasted. Smearcase, a fresh, soft farmer's cheese made from clabbered milk, drained and lightly salted, was spread thick over toasted bread and served alongside a bowl of stewed dried prunes cooked with a stick of cinnamon and a small amount of brown sugar. It sounds simple. It was simple. But the quality of Pennsylvania Dutch smearcase, made from the milk of well-kept cows and properly drained overnight, bore no resemblance to modern cottage cheese or cream cheese. It was clean, faintly tangy, and extraordinarily fresh. The stewed prunes provided natural sweetness and aided digestion during long work mornings. Pennsylvania German community cookbooks from the 1860s through the 1910s document smearcase on toast as a standard breakfast item at Berks, Lancaster, and Lebanon County Road diners. When dairy farming consolidated in Pennsylvania and small farmstead cheese production ended, authentic smearcase became impossible to source commercially. The dish lost its ingredient and its identity simultaneously. 15. Fried rabbit gravy on hoe cakes, Kentucky Hollow Diner. Kentucky's hollow communities, the tight settlements tucked between ridge lines and creek beds throughout the eastern part of the state, ran on rabbit. Rabbit stew, rabbit fricassee, rabbit pie. And for breakfast, fried rabbit gravy on hoe cakes. The rabbit would be cut small, dredged in seasoned flour and fried until cooked through. Then the drippings and browned flour left in the pan became the base of a thick, peppery white gravy that was poured hot over hoe cakes. Thin, crisp cornmeal cakes cooked directly on the griddle without fat. The contrast between the rough, grainy hoe cake and the rich, smooth gravy made the plate far more complex than its humble ingredients suggested. Eastern Kentucky hollow diners and general store eating counters served this combination regularly from the 1870s well into the 1930s, documented in several surviving Harlan and Leslie County community records. Wild rabbit populations declined sharply in eastern Kentucky through the 1940s and 1950s due to land clearing and hunting pressure, and the reliable supply that had sustained this dish for decades simply disappeared. Without affordable, accessible rabbit, the recipe lost its reason to exist and left the menu permanently. 16. Cattail pollen pancakes with wild honey. Midwest Prairie counter. This is perhaps the most genuinely forgotten breakfast on this entire list. Cattail pollen pancakes. In the wetland communities of the Midwest Prairie, the small settlements built along river margins and marsh edges in Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana, the dense yellow pollen of the common cattail was harvested each June in significant quantities and used as a flour supplement that turned ordinary pancakes a vivid golden color and gave them a faintly sweet, nutty flavor unlike anything produced by conventional grain. Mixed at a ratio of roughly half cattail pollen to half wheat flour, the batter produced a pancake that was lighter than standard but with a depth of flavor that modern diners cannot replicate. Wild honey, gathered from hollow trees and limestone cliff colonies throughout the Prairie River valleys, was poured over the finished cakes. Midwest Prairie settlement records from the 1840s through the 1880s document cattail pollen as a common flour supplement in wetland communities. As wetlands were drained for agriculture through the late 1800s and early 1900s, cattail access disappeared, the pollen supply ended, and this entirely unique American breakfast ingredient was forgotten so completely that most food historians have never encountered it. 17. Pickled pig's feet and fried eggs. Illinois Route 60, Six-Pack Diner. Before Route 66 became a tourist destination, before it became a symbol, it was a working road. Truckers, migrants, traveling salesmen, and field laborers used it to move across the country, and they ate at the diners that sat just off the pavement in the small Illinois towns that the highway threaded through. At those diners, particularly in the southern half of the state where the culture ran more southern than Midwestern, pickled pig's feet and fried eggs was a legitimate breakfast plate that sat on the menu board without apology. The pig's feet, brined in vinegar, red pepper, and bay leaf for at least a week, were served cold alongside 2 eggs fried hard in lard, with a piece of white bread for sopping. The acidity of the pickle cut through the richness of the fried egg yolk in a way that was genuinely sophisticated underneath its rough exterior. Illinois Road Diner records and Route 66 traveler accounts from the 1930s and 1940s document this plate at multiple stops between East St. Louis and Springfield. When highway culture shifted toward fast food in the 1960s and the old Route 66 diners began closing, this plate went with them. It has never reappeared on any American menu since. 18. Liver mush patties with red-eye gravy. North Carolina Mountain Diner. Liver mush is one of those regional foods that has survived in its home territory, the western Piedmont and mountain counties of North Carolina, but has remained almost completely invisible to the rest of the country. In Shelby, in Morganton, in the small counter diners that line the mountain roads of Burke and Caldwell counties, liver mush has never disappeared. But the version paired with red-eye gravy, served as a mountain diner breakfast plate through the first half of the 20th century, has. Liver mush is a cooked loaf of pork liver, head parts, and cornmeal, sliced and fried until the outside forms a dark, almost lacquered crust. Red-eye gravy, made by deglazing the pan with black coffee after frying country ham, was poured directly over the crisp liver mush patties. The bitterness of the coffee gravy against the mineral richness of the liver created a combination that was aggressively regional and entirely unrepeatable. North Carolina Mountain County diners documented in WPA Federal Writers Project records from the late 1930s list this pairing consistently as a feature morning plate. As red-eye gravy faded from mountain diner menus after World War II, the livermush lost its most important companion and the plate ceased to exist in its original form. 19. Smoked carp hash with dill potatoes, Iowa River Town breakfast. The Iowa and Mississippi River towns that grew up in the 19th century along the bluffs and bottomlands of eastern Iowa developed a food culture rooted entirely in what the river provided. Carp, abundant, cheap, and completely ignored by modern American cuisine, was the central protein of that culture. Smoked carp hash was the breakfast expression of it. Cold smoked carp, flaked from the bone, fried with diced boiled potatoes that had been tossed in fresh dill, and a small amount of butter, seasoned with black pepper and a splash of apple cider vinegar at the finish. The smoke of the fish ran through the entire hash, the dill brightened it, and the vinegar sharpened the whole plate into something genuinely worth eating. Bohemian and German immigrant communities in Iowa's river towns, communities in towns like Dubuque, Gutenberg, and Bellevue, brought the smoked fish tradition with them from Central Europe and adapted it to the American river. Iowa County Historical Society records from the 1880s and 1890s document smoked carp as a regular feature of small river town diners. Water pollution in the Iowa and Mississippi rivers through the mid-20th century devastated fish populations. The smoking tradition ended, and the hash vanished with the fish. 20. Lard biscuits with blackstrap molasses and butter, Arkansas Hollow Stop. There is a specific Arkansas biscuit that exists outside the realm of modern Southern cooking entirely. It is not fluffy. It is not tall. It is dense, slightly heavy, with a crust that crackles when you break it and an interior that is rich and slightly greasy from the lard worked into the flour by hand. These were the biscuits made at Arkansas Hollow Stops, the tiny roadside eating places that served the workers and travelers moving through the Washita and Ozark Highland roads. Split open while still hot, a thick layer of cold butter laid inside to melt, then blackstrap molasses, dark, almost bittersweet, with a depth of flavor that regular molasses cannot approach, poured into the cavity and absorbed into the warm bread. It was not a refined breakfast. It was not meant to be. It was meant to keep a man working until noon in hard country. Arkansas Hollow Community records and WPA interviews from the 1930s document this as the most common backroad breakfast offering throughout the Highland counties. When commercial shortening replaced lard in rural Arkansas kitchens through the 1940s and 1950s, the specific texture and character of these biscuits changed permanently. The original version has not been replicated since. 21. Hulled corn porridge with salt pork, Appalachian morning bowl. Long before grits became a Southern restaurant staple, long before they were dressed with shrimp and garnished with microgreens, there was hulled corn porridge, a rougher, older, more direct ancestor that sustained Appalachian working families for generations. Hulled corn, also called hominy in some traditions but distinct from the canned product sold today, was dried field corn soaked in wood ash lye water to remove the hull, then dried again and coarsely ground. Cooked slowly in water with a heavy piece of salt pork dropped into the pot, the porridge that resulted was thick, dense, smoky from the pork fat, and deeply sustaining in a way that modern instant grits cannot approximate. Appalachian small-town diner records from Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky counties document hulled corn porridge as a standard morning offering well into the 1920s. It required the kind of whole kernel corn processing that small rural mills provided, and as those mills closed through the early 20th century and commercial corn products took over, the specific grain that made the dish possible disappeared from the supply chain. The porridge had no replacement that matched it, and it left the diner menu permanently within a single decade. 22. Brains and eggs with biscuit gravy, Missouri farmhouse diner. Before the industrialization of American meat processing removed variety cuts from the mainstream food supply, brains were not unusual. They were cheap, available, and highly perishable, which meant they moved directly from the slaughterhouse to the nearest diner counter rather than being shipped anywhere. In Missouri, where hog farming defined the rural economy, pork brains scrambled with eggs was a farmhouse diner staple from the mid-1800s well into the 1940s. The brains were briefly blanched to firm them, then broken apart and scrambled into eggs over medium heat until just set, creamy, rich, with a delicate flavor that is entirely unlike any other pork product. Biscuit gravy, thick, peppery white gravy made from pan drippings and milk, was spooned over the finished plate. Missouri County Fair records and farmhouse cookbook collections from the 1880s through the 1920s document brains and eggs consistently as a feature of small rural diner menus throughout the state. Federal meat inspection regulations tightened significantly after World War II, and the casual transfer of variety cuts from local slaughter to local diners became legally and logistically impossible. Brains disappeared from Missouri diner menus almost overnight as a direct result, and the dish has never returned. 23. Fried poke salad with scrambled eggs. West Virginia Roadside Cafe. Poke salad, the young spring shoots of the common pokeweed plant, was Appalachian survival food before it was anything else. Properly prepared through multiple boilings to neutralize its natural toxins, poke salad becomes a dark, tender green with a flavor somewhere between spinach and mustard greens, but more complex than either. West Virginia roadside cafes served it fried with scrambled eggs every spring from approximately April through early June, which was the only window when the young shoots were safe and palatable. A cast iron skillet, a spoonful of lard, the boiled and drained poke salad wilted further in the fat, then eggs broken directly over it and scrambled together until just set. It was one of the earliest fresh green foods available after winter, and in communities where fresh vegetables were scarce through the cold months, it carried genuine cultural and nutritional significance. West Virginia WPA Federal Writers Project records from the 1930s document poke salad as a seasonal morning staple at roadside cafes throughout the southern and central counties. As commercial vegetable supply chains reached rural West Virginia through the 1940s and 1950s, the seasonal necessity of poke salad ended. The cafes stopped preparing it, younger cooks never learned the proper preparation method, and a distinctly Appalachian breakfast tradition quietly disappeared. 24. Blood pudding patties with fried apples. German Texan Hill Country Diner. The Texas Hill Country is one of the most culturally distinct regions in the entire American South, shaped almost entirely by the waves of German immigrants who settled its limestone hills and river valleys beginning in the 1840s. Those immigrants brought their food traditions with them, and in the small hill country town diners of Fredericksburg, Comfort, and New Braunfels, blood pudding patties appeared on the breakfast menu without any sense of apology or exoticism. Blood pudding, made from fresh pork blood, cooked grain, fat, and spices pressed into a loaf and sliced, was pan-fried until the outside crisped and the interior stayed dense and moist. Beside it on the plate, fried apples, thick slices cooked in butter and brown sugar until caramelized and slightly collapsed, provided a sweet counterpoint that balanced the mineral richness of the pudding completely. German Texan community cookbooks from the Gillespie and Kendall County area, published between the 1880s and 1920s, document this breakfast pairing as a standard morning offering at Hill Country Road diners. As German Texan communities assimilated through the mid-20th century and traditional hog butchering practices ended, blood pudding production ceased at the local level. The breakfast plate lost its central ingredient and was never reconstructed. 25. Sourdough starter hotcakes with pine nut butter. Oregon Trail Road Stop. The Oregon Trail Road Stop is the final entry on this list, and it is the one that connects most directly to the origins of American westward movement. Sourdough starter was not a trend in the American West. It was a survival tool. Travelers and settlers who could not reliably access commercial yeast kept living sourdough starters alive across thousands of miles of prairie and mountain, feeding them daily, protecting them through winter, and using them to leaven everything from bread to hotcakes. At the road stops that grew up along the Oregon Trail corridor in what is now Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, sourdough hotcakes made from starters that were sometimes decades old were a morning constant. The pine nut butter, roasted Great Basin pine nuts ground with a small amount of rendered fat and a pinch of salt into a rough paste, was the regional condiment that no Eastern cook had ever encountered. The combination of the deeply tangy sourdough cake and the rich, resinous pine nut butter was entirely specific to the West and entirely unlike anything served anywhere else in America. Oregon Territory settler journals from the 1850s and 1860s document both the hotcakes and the pine nut butter at permanent trail stop establishments. As the trail era ended and commercial infrastructure reached the Pacific Northwest, the pine nut butter tradition ended with the culture that produced it, and this final forgotten American breakfast disappeared into history. These 25 breakfasts did not disappear because they were bad. They disappeared because the world that needed them was gone. The diners closed, the roads emptied, and the recipes died with the cooks who never wrote them down. If this video brought back a memory, leave it in the comments below. Subscribe and we will keep finding what America forgot.